During the Renaissance, England lagged far behind Italy and Germany when it came to martial arts. So, during the reign of Henry VIII, the Company of Maesters was established, and this was designed to be a guild that looked to regulate the teaching of martial arts in England, but it largely just fizzled out and was disbanded. However, shortly afterwards, Joseph Swetham published The Art of Defense, and in it he teaches how people should use a dagger, sword, or quarterstaff, and we can get some sort of sense of what they were looking to teach in the Company of Maesters. But the quarterstaff in particular was important because it has been described as England's national weapon. In fact, many guides were written about the quarterstaff, and theoretically it could have been used in times of war, but this seems a little dubious. Otherwise, fencing was incredibly popular as well, and in Samuel Pepys's diary, he explains how he went to the Bear Garden to watch a few bloody events. However, in terms of, let's say, weaponless combat, the English had things like boxing and Cornish wrestling, or different regional variations of wrestling, and they also had shin kicking, but they would have to wait until the 19th century until anything like the Asian martial arts came to England. Edward William Barton Wright tried to create an English style of martial arts after visiting Japan, but he made it incredibly English by including things like jackets and canes in his defences. However, his clubs proved to be too expensive and it died out. However, it could have been very useful because Victorian London, well, the people in Victorian London were often armed. The police and criminals often used a sort of crude truncheon called a cudgel. Hat pins were made longer for women to use in self-defense. Some canes included blades, and there seems to be evidence that some people turned their canes into guns. But this brings me on to gun laws in England, well, more specifically weapon laws in England, because this goes right the way back to 1181, when all free men except Jews were required to arm themselves. By law, every knight had to have a lance, a shield, and mail. Every free man in a borough had to have an iron cap, padded jacket, and a lance, etc., etc., etc. Now, in later centuries, it wasn't necessary for every person to have arms, but in the English Bill of Rights in the 17th century, every Englishman was given the right to bear arms. This Bill of Rights, however, came after the Glorious Revolution, which was a pretty much anti-Catholic affair, so Catholics weren't allowed to bear arms, but the majority of English were allowed to bear arms for centuries. There was some early legislation, like in 1870, you had to buy a license to carry a gun outside, but this only cost 10 shillings and was pretty much only introduced as a way to generate money. And in the early 20th century, some mentally unstable people were not allowed to have arms, but the real change only came in 1920. Now, to put this into some sort of context, by 1920, the Irish had already risen up, communist revolutionaries were sweeping across Europe, and vets had returned home from the trenches. So, to prevent a revolution in England, the 1920 Act allowed authorities to deny people gun licenses. In 1937, automatic weapons were banned, and eventually throughout the 20th century, more and more laws were introduced. Now, that's not to say there weren't any weapons laws in Britain before this. For instance, after the Jacobite Rebellion, the Highland clans were disarmed, and vagrants could be arrested for carrying weapons as well. But in Victorian London, at least, and throughout most of English history, people were often armed or could easily arm themselves.